Ancient Rome. For generations, people have been fascinated by the splendor, the glory, the decadence of Rome. Books, novels, songs, movies, TV series all indicate a never-ending interest. Where do we begin? We begin with a legend. The 8th century BCE, two babies were left on the side of the road. A wolf discovers them, suckles them, raises them. Romulus and Remus. The boys grow up, they quarrel, and Romulus kills Remus, and he founds a settlement that he calls Rome. Now, this of course is legend, but there probably was a Romulus, and he probably killed his brother Remus in a power struggle. So Romulus becomes the first king of the small kingdom of Rome, and Rome is surrounded by the Etruscans, a very important people. The Etruscans drained the marshes around Rome, encouraged trade, and developed a political system that Rome later assimilated. Well, Romulus dies, and the second king of Rome is Numa Pompilius, who used many religious festivals to distract people from their warmongering ways. Centuries later, there was a king Tarquin. Now, Tarquin built sewers, he went to war with his neighbors, and he built a temple to Jupiter, but he was very much hated by his people. Now, Tarquin's son, Prince Sextus, was lusting after a Roman woman named Lucretia. He tries to seduce her, but she would not give in. Finally, he rapes her. Lucretia is humiliated. Now, even though Sextus had threatened Lucretia, she approached her husband and other family members, told them what happened. Then she pulled out a knife and stabbed herself to death. Everybody was shocked. Now, Lucretia's cousin, Junius Brutus, leads a rebellion against King Tarquin and his family. They drive the Tarquins out of the kingdom. Now, as for Tarquin's son, Sextus the rapist, he went to another land, but when people there found out what he had done, he was assassinated. Now, when Junius Brutus takes over, he didn't take over as king. He became a chief executive, a consul. Rome was no longer a monarchy. It would become a republic, and it would remain so for 500 years. There would be 2 consuls elected in, and there would also be a senate. There would be checks and balances. Now, Rome spread through war and expanded to take over what is today present-day Italy. Now, Rome would do a lot to spread Greek culture, but its greatest gift to civilization was its legal code. Ideas such as innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof is on the accuser. In the Roman family, the father had enormous power. He married off his children as he saw fit, dominated his sons until he died, dominated his daughters until they got married to their husbands. He had so much power he could even punish and kill his own family members. Now, among the nobles, boys would go to school on rooftops. If it was at night, they carried lanterns. Now, Rome was mostly rural, agricultural, but as it annexed other lands, food supplies grew too much. So people began to move to the city. Eventually, in the 2nd century AD, there would be 1 million people in 9 square miles. So outside of the splendor and the glory of the Roman city were slums and squalor. The Latin language was a mixture of Etruscan and Greek. Romans would spread the Latin language, and the Roman Catholic Church gave Mass in language well into the 20th century. These scary looking things are Roman medical tools, as Rome built some of the earliest hospitals. And after thousands of years, some of Rome's stone roads and arches are still standing today. In the Roman Colosseums, they were built for games and chariot races. Now, contrary to the movies, gladiators usually did not fight to the death. It was too expensive to train and have a gladiator later killed. But they would have criminals fight to the death. The Romans had a strong bloodlust. Later, they would feed the Christians to the lions, and they would kill many, many animals. Under Caesar Augustus alone, 3,500 elephants were killed for sport. Now, the superstitious Romans had their mythological gods: Apollo, Jupiter, Venus, Neptune, Mars, Mercury, Diana, Minerva. Divorce was frowned upon. The common Roman was not as promiscuous as we sometimes believe. However, in Roman culture, it was very sex-saturated. It was reflected in graffiti, paintings, sculptures, and plays. Now, in the beginning of the Republic, the Roman military was made up of poor men, the plebeians, common people. But when they were away, women often had to borrow money from the nobles. When the men returned, the whole family was in debt. This practice became so abusive that the plebeians demanded and finally got more rights and representations from the tribunes. Tribune comes from the word tribe. You see, the rich had to please the poor. They needed the poor to make up the army to fight the Gauls. The Gauls are what makes up today's France, Belgium, most of Switzerland, northern Italy, Germany, and part of the Netherlands. Rome and the Gauls would be at war for centuries. And in one of these wars, the famous mathematician Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier while he was doing calculations. In these wars, Rome would take Spain, Greece, Asia Minor, North Africa, allowing conquered independence in exchange for tribute and slaves. The slave trade gave huge profits. In one island of Delos, they would move 10,000 slaves a day. At one point, there would be so many slaves that it would push the farmers off the land and into the city, which became overcrowded, very diverse. The housing was terrible, expensive, and corrupt. Senators controlled gangs that controlled the streets. Now, I'm not going to go deep into the Punic Wars because I talked about that extensively in my previous video. It's enough to say that after the Punic Wars, Rome dominated the Mediterranean trade. In 74 BCE, Spartacus, a slave, led a revolt that lasted for 2 years. The Senate approaches Gaius Marcus Licinius Crassus to deal with the problem, and Crassus destroys the slave revolt. He crucified thousands of slaves, put them along a road as a warning. But now Crassus wants to be a consul. But then Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, also wants to become consul, and he takes credit. And then we have a popular politician and general, Gaius Julius Caesar, who also wants power. Julius Caesar, rich and brilliant, militarily, his biggest triumph was to defeat the Gauls. And by doing so, he brought the whole region to Rome and westernized it. The number of dead is appalling. Some say over 1 million. Now, Caesar aligned himself with Crassus and Pompey. Caesar has his daughter marry Pompey, and the 3 men form a government of 3, the first triumvirate. But this is short-lived. Caesar's daughter would die in childbirth, cutting off his family tie to Pompey, and Crassus decides to invade present-day Iran, and when he does, he dies in battle. Now, the ambitious Caesar was governing Gaul at the time. This leaves paranoid, suspicious Pompey along with the Senate. The Senate convinces Pompey that Caesar is too ambitious, and they tell him to call Caesar to come to Rome. Caesar suspects that he's going to be stripped of his title. So he says, okay, I'll go to Rome, but he brought his army with him. It would be civil war for 2 years. Eventually, Pompey flees. He escapes to Egypt, where he is killed. Who killed him? To answer that, we need to consider that in Egypt, Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII were in a power struggle. Ptolemy thought that he would please Caesar by killing Pompey. Instead, this angered Caesar. He had the assassins killed, became Cleopatra's lover, and gave her a son. Caesar would help Cleopatra, making her pharaoh. Ptolemy drowned in the Nile River. Now, in this civil war, unfortunately, the Library of Alexandria, with all its literary and scientific achievements documented, would burn to the ground. Caesar returned to Rome in triumph, but on March 15, 44 BCE, he was stabbed to death by his enemies in the Senate. Caesar's grandnephew and heir, Octavian, and Caesar's lieutenant, Mark Antony, would hunt down the assassins. They formed a second triumvirate along with a nobleman named Lepidus. But Lepidus was ineffective. He was exiled. Octavian and Mark Antony divided the region of Rome. Mark Antony would govern from Egypt, the eastern part, and Octavian stayed on the western part in Rome. Mark Antony falls madly in love with Pharaoh Cleopatra and gives her children. He negates his duties in Rome. Octavian capitalizes on this, and the 2 men go to war. Octavian takes the war to Egypt, where he is successful. Mark Antony, abandoned by many of his troops, and Cleopatra commits suicide, leaving Octavian as the sole ruler. So Octavian becomes a sole ruler and he takes the name of Augustus Caesar. The Republic ends and the Roman Empire begins. Now Augustus Caesar was one of the most influential people of all time. His armies completed the conquest of several lands including Spain and Switzerland. He revised the tax structure, the financial system, built a permanent navy, organized a Praetorian Guard, built a network of roads, built beautiful cities and temples. He governed for 40 years, and even after he died, there was 200 years of peace. They call it the Pax Romana. Despite the tyrants that followed, this peace persisted. Rome not only acquired innovations of previous civilizations, such as the Greeks, it also was a conduit to pass this information on. When Augustus died, his stepson Tiberius becomes the emperor. He was a very efficient, thrifty administrator, but unfortunately Tiberius was a pedophile who had little boys and girls swim around in his pool. He called them his little fishes. Tiberius was hated. It was at this time that Jesus of Nazareth was out preaching and would be crucified. In 37 AD, Tiberius dies, and his nephew becomes emperor, Gaius, nicknamed Caligula. Epileptic, insomniac, he had incest with several of his sisters. He was prone to hysterics. He would humiliate the people around him and assassinate anybody for no particular reason. After 4 orgy-filled, decadent, perverted years, he was assassinated. Caligula's assassins wanted to bring back the Republic, but the military had other ideas. They put Caligula's aging uncle Claudius on the throne. Now Claudius seemed like they could be able to control him. He was a stutterer, he was lame, but he fooled everybody and ruled well. He conquered Britain and founded the city of London. Now Claudius did expel the Christians from the city after some riots broke out, and he slaughtered many Jews. Now Claudius would die. Rumor that he was poisoned by his wife Agrippina, who, by the way, was his niece. Agrippina made sure that her son Nero would become the next emperor. Well, Nero had his own mother Agrippina killed. He stripped people of their wealth. He was very corrupt. He was a hated oppressor. And he had Paul and Peter, the apostles of Jesus, killed. In 64 AD, when a fire broke out in Rome, Nero blamed the Christians. Now, it's not true that Nero started the fire. He was many miles away. But he blamed the Christians, and he took them, persecuted them, and lit many of them up as human torches. He went around in a chariot enjoying the spectacle. Nero killed thousands of Christians and outlawed Christianity. Eventually, Nero would run away and commit suicide. 70 AD, Rome is tired of the instability in Jerusalem. It's also tired of the struggles between Jews and Christians. It decides to take over. 115,000 were killed. Tens of thousands were enslaved. Many were used in the games as sport. Hillsides were stripped of trees for military camps. There was a huge famine and a story of a mother who ended up eating her own son. It was a very unstable time. In 1 year, there were 4 emperors. But finally, in 110 AD, Trajan brought some stability. He also stopped the persecution of the Christians. In the movie Gladiator, Richard Harris played Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic emperor who wrote the book Meditations, a guide of quotations that are still heard of today. Emperor Diocletian decided that Rome was too large to govern alone, so he split the empire in two and had his friend Maximian govern from the west. Now, Diocletian once had his fortune tellers unable to read the entrails of an animal. He blamed these Christians with their little sign of the cross. He thought they had jinxed his fortune tellers, so he had bishops arrested, Bibles burnt, and churches torn down. Diocletian installed a new policy where poor people would work for rich landowners. They would live off the land and give the bulk to the landowners. This system is called serfdom. Now, the bad thing is, if you were a serf, you would remain a serf for life. And so did your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. This system lasted over 1,000 years. Now, in 305 AD, Diocletian abdicates and lives the rest of his life gardening somewhere in Croatia. In 312 AD, Emperor Constantine becomes the emperor and later becomes a Christian. He allows the Christians to take riches away from the pagans. He tires of the disagreements in dogma among religious leaders, so he has bishops get together in the Council of Nicaea to keep the faith uniform, one faith, one interpretation. He also founds a capital in the east, a new city, Constantinople. Constantine dies and his son Julian becomes emperor. Now Julian worshipped Zeus, so he had the Christians return the money they had taken from the pagans. When Valens becomes emperor, he makes a major mistake. Some Visigoths, which is a Germanic tribe, wanted to migrate to Rome like refugees. Well, Valens said yes because they were trying to escape persecution. Unfortunately, too many Germanic tribes came in. The Roman people treated these migrants badly. When the Visigoths were starving, they said, "Hey, give me one of your children as a slave, and I'll give you one of my dogs so you could eat it." Well, the migrants eventually rebelled. Now, these barbarians, and remember, barbarians means foreigners. They're not cavemen or anything like that. These barbarians entered Rome as well from other lands. The Alans and the Huns invaded. And Valens fights the barbarians, but he dies in battle. His body was never found, and the Roman army falls on August 9th, 378 AD. Emperor Theodosius brought about a little uneasy peace. What he did was he was mildly successful in getting these Germanic tribes to fight each other, but the Roman Empire was falling apart. It's time to talk about one of the most influential writers of all time, philosopher and bishop Augustine, who wrote The City of God. Now, Augustine talks about original sin. We're all born sinners. Well, that's what we're taught today, nothing new, but at the time, Pelagius was promoting the idea that people were born good and later got corrupted. Well, based on these writings, Pelagius was exiled. Augustine thought that sexual thoughts were very, very impure, causing a lot of guilt, even today. He wrote a book called The City of God, talking about a celestial kingdom and pushing forward the thoughts of church over state. This influenced the world for many, many years. Now look at this map, the Roman Empire at its peak. By 475 AD, the Western Empire had been taken over by barbarians. The Eastern Empire would go on for another 1,000 years. The last Western Roman would fall in 476 AD. Number 1, barbarian invasion. The Visigoths had depleted Rome of its territories. Number 2, rise of the Eastern Empire. By the 3rd century, Diocletian had divided empire in two, and that was good for the short run, but East and West didn't work well together, and they drifted apart. Number 3, economic troubles and financial crisis, the constant wars, overspending, not enough jobs, dependent slaves, and pirates in the Mediterranean choking off trade. Number 4, overexpansion and military spending. It was a nightmare to govern such a big land, difficult to communicate even with the roads. So much money was being poured into the military to maintain this empire. Number 5, corruption. When emperors and politicians and the military want that greedy money, well, there's no stability. Number 6, barbarian migrations. When the barbarian invaders came in, there were already a lot of migrants that were living in Rome. So you had enemies inside and outside the borders. Reason number 7, the rise of Christianity. Power was now being shared by church and state. Reason number 8, a weak military. There were not enough soldiers, so mercenaries were hired. Now, mercenaries are good soldiers, but they have no loyalty to the empire. Now, I have one final fascinating thought. The very last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was named Romulus, and the very first king of Rome was named Romulus, 1,200 years before. That's it for now, but my next video would be Ancient China. In the meantime, give me your thoughts, comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.